a starting point, environmental risk involves essentially three things. There are many more ways to describe it, but this is the simplest way. You have a source, so you have contamination in the soil or the groundwater. You have the receptors. Usually it's us, people, but you can have ecological receptors or, birds, wild animals, whatever. And then for there to be risk, you need a pathway between the source and the receptor. And vapor intrusion is one of those pathways. Another key pathway I know a lot of people are concerned about here is tap water. Will the contamination that's underground make it into your municipal water supply? I will touch on that a little bit. It's a very complicated groundwater situation around here. There are people who know much more about it than I do. But there is one link between the I call it tap water rather than drinking water, because I've been on committees with some of the world's top experts in exposure to these kinds of chemicals. And it turns out that in a typical home, you may be exposed more to volatile compounds, such as the ones I'm going to be talking about, through a shower, as opposed to what you're doing to cook or to drink. That a shower will create vapors. So the vapor pathway from tap water is as important as the actual drinking pathway. Now, I countered that, saying it depends upon whether you're a teenage boy or a teenage girl. Because teenage boys never take showers and teenage girls take very long showers. So it's a gender-related risk in that instance. But I'm going to be addressing vapor intrusion for three scenarios. For the existing buildings on the property, the old Hoover property, proposed new construction on the property, and then the off-site area primarily to the west of the property. Vapor intrusion is literally rising to the surface all over the country. US EPA started working on a guidance, sort of a technical document explaining how to investigate and respond to vapor intrusion in 2002. The Bush administration pushed it to the side. When Obama appointed some people to EPA, they restarted it again, and they're going to rush it out in 2009, and a month or two ago, they finally released it. So we now have a final vapor intrusion guidance or guide, and that's key for a lot of parts of the country. Some states like California, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York have detailed vapor intrusion guidances of their own. For those states that don't, we're expecting the promulgation of the guidance to speed the recognition and investigation of potential vapor intrusion sites. Now, I used to call vapor intrusion rocket science. You know, when you look at groundwater contamination, you look at what's in the water, is it above or below the standard that's set by the health agencies? Vapor intrusion is much more complicated, and that's what I'm going to try to introduce you to tonight. But I stopped calling it rocket science because in my community, I remember we had a meeting somewhat like this, and people went around the room at the beginning of the meeting, and about half the people at the meeting were rocket scientists. They didn't understand anything about vapor intrusion. So it's actually fairly complicated. People can understand the basics of it, but some of the world's top scientists meet 2 or 3 times a year at conferences, and they're still learning a lot about the subject, because it's still a rather new way to look at contamination. So this is your generic building. And under the building, you can either have contamination that was released on the property, it was in the soil, or you can have contamination with groundwater. And since groundwater moves, then they are coming from off-site. It didn't have to be released on the subject. Now, what's groundwater? Well, when you dig a hole in the ground and you finally put in a well, when you get water, that's groundwater. And groundwater is water that's sort of mixed in with the soil. It's not like you've got a reservoir that's all water. It's water that's in the clay, the sand, whatever you have down underground. And groundwater moves in general. So what happens is the contamination from the groundwater or the soil volatilizes. It becomes a vapor. And it area where the soil, it's called Beto stone by the experts. It basically is the soil above the water table. And particularly when the water table moves up and down, you have more of these vapors in this area. Now what happens is that the lower air pressure in a typical building sucks up the contamination inside into the building. Is that a vacuum? Ironic. So, again, we have volatile compounds underground. A portion of them, yeah, you can do that by closer. Sorry. A portion of them volatilize or vaporize, and then the buildings actually suck up the contamination because there's typically a lower pressure inside and outside. And in cold parts of the country, this area is included. In the winter, that's when we usually have this pressure differential at the strongest, and that's when you see the most vapor intrusion. So again, you're pulling up the contamination from underneath, it goes into the building, and spreads out throughout the building. The concentrations you can find in the subsurface are typically greater than you find inside. This is one of those rocket science issues. And so experts always try to figure out what's the ratio between the concentration here to the concentration inside when it spreads out throughout the building. Now, how does an investigative team determine whether there's vapor intrusion? They start out usually looking at the maps of groundwater contamination and say, these are the areas where we want to focus. And sometimes they'll focus on the areas where the groundwater contamination is the biggest. Now, there are some instances where, for one reason or another, they found indoor contamination, and from that they found the groundwater contamination. But usually you start by looking at the groundwater. So what they typically do is they sample the indoor air, the soil gas, and the outdoor air. Now, in some places they just start with the soil gas, and if they don't find anything, they don't go inside. In my community, EPA does all three at once. It's called multiple lines of evidence. What they use, there are two primary instruments they use. There's it's called a summa canister. The summa canister is about the size of a bowling ball made out of metal with a valve in the bottom. And it comes from a lab with a vacuum. And you put it inside, or you have it through a little piece of tube going to the subsurface, or you have it outside. You open up the valve for 8 hours, 24 hours. The air or vapor moves inside, close it, and send it to the lab to analyze it. There's also they now have methods of using what's called sorbent devices, where there's a sort of a textile that absorbs stuff in a little tube you put inside the house, and that is a fairly good accurate measurement as well. So what they do is they measure the indoor air concentration, they measure the soil gas, and they measure the outdoor air. Why do they have to do all three? Well, if you find something inside, you know there's contamination inside, and that's a risk. But it might not be coming from the subsurface. If in my community there was a house that got a vapor intrusion, it turned out to be plastic cement that contained trichloroethylene, which is one of the principal contaminants of concern that we're looking at. Some places people have recently dry cleaned clothes, and if they're still using PCE, tetrachloroethylene, to clean the clothes, your dry cleaned clothes can off-gas stuff. And in many parts of the country, actually in my community, gun cleaner has a lot of PCE. There's one place in Southern California, this guy said, I don't have any PCE in my house, it's got to be coming from the subsurface. And after going back several times, when they finally brought an instrument that would pinpoint where it was, he had a gun in the closet with a can of gun cleaner that was closed but not closed well enough to prevent the PCE from coming into the air. So you can measure what's in here, but you don't know where it's coming from. You find it inside, and you don't find it in the subsurface. If you don't find it in the subsurface at a higher level, a much higher level, it's probably not coming in from here. It's probably coming from another source. Similarly, if you find it in the outdoor air at the same level as the indoor air, that suggests that there's not a subsurface source, but an outdoor source. So there are some places around the country, dry cleaners in New York City, in In Pennsylvania, there were some metal tubing plants that were using trichloroethylene and releasing it into the atmosphere at high levels. But what they were finding inside didn't come from the subsurface, it came from outside. And so you have to measure all those things. There are other methods, much more complicated methods. There are real-time instruments that you can use that are fairly expensive, like a suitcase size. You can walk around and you can, every 10 seconds or 60 seconds it tells you what's there. EPA has a van with a long tubing on it that you can do that. And that's good for actually finding out whether there's a hole in the floor or there's a can of something inside and pinpointing it. Those methods are being used increasingly, but they tend to be more expensive and they aren't used as much as the standard method using the sealant canister. Now I mentioned holes in the floor. So where there's a hole in the floor, somebody drilled a hole and put in a wire. I know I did that in my house when we still used internet cables. For plumbing, whatever, there might be a hole in the floor. There could be cracks in the slab. And it turns out that the concrete itself is permeable to these chemicals. So you can actually have chemicals coming up through concrete. So you not only need a pressure differential, you need a way for the gases to make it through. So it turns out when you do an investigation for vapor intrusion, there are two key things that determine whether you're going to have a problem. The first one is the contamination there in the subsurface. And the more contamination there is in the subsurface, the closer it is to the bottom of the building, whether it's a crawl space or a slab or a basement, you're going to fall. Then you have a good chance of having vapor intrusion. If there's a dirt basement in particular, that's a higher risk. If somebody has a wet basement, water from the water table comes up and into your basement, that's releasing contamination directly into the house if it volatilizes. So you need the source and you need the pathway. And so in many cases, it's the way how well the house is built and how it's built determine how easily the contamination makes it up inside. And I remember a friend of mine has a house in New York on the Hudson Valley, and they don't do this where I live, but basically there's a gap between the wall and the slab. I don't know whether they do that here, but they basically, when EPA found vapors in their house, they immediately sealed that gap. So how a building is built also determines. So you can't assume that just because there are high levels underground that there's a problem. And you can't assume because you find nothing inside that there isn't the potential for a problem, because our slabs tend to crack over time. Now where I live it's earthquakes, but in other parts of the country it's the freeze-thaw cycle. You can't count on an intact piece of concrete, even if it's impermeable to these gases, to remain impermeable indefinitely. So sometimes you take action, not based on what you've measured inside, but on what you find underneath. So New York State, in their own guidance, says if you find a whole lot of contamination underneath, you're going to take action whether or not you found it at unacceptable levels inside. Now, the good thing about vapor intrusion is it can be mitigated. Now, in the long run, the solution is to clean up all these chemicals underground. That turns out, in many places, to be very difficult, take decades. In my community, we have so much contamination, we figure it's going to take centuries. So that's what you'd like to do, but while you're doing it, you have to protect the people inside the buildings. And so it's called mitigation. What mitigation does is it lowers, the goal of mitigation is to lower the vapor pressure under the building. And I mentioned the vapors in the soil, and just as there's pretty water in the soil, you can have soil that looks like pretty solid dirt, but there are vapors in it, and they come up. So in an existing building, what they'll do is they'll drill a hole, stick a pipe like PVC or something with holes in it, connect that to a fan, and vent it outside the building. contamination. And that's true to some degree. But the reason why it's particularly effective is it lowers the vapor pressure underneath the building below what it is inside. So it's called sub-slab depressurization, substructure depressurization. Now, this is a part of the country that has a lot of radon. This is exactly the technology that they use to mitigate radon from coming underneath. In fact, sometimes radon inside is a way of determining whether the slab or the floor is permeable to the other gases. Now, the distribution of radon is different from the distribution of volatile organic compounds. So it's not like there's a one, you can just measure radon and make a direct inference for what you're going to find inside. But it's a decent indicator. But the main thing is that we know that radon mitigation, the radon mitigation technology, which is proven to keep the gases outside the house or other buildings, can, by lowering the pressure inside, cause whatever areas to flow downward rather than contamination flowing up. And so where it's done right, where the systems are installed properly, where the fan is strong enough, where the ports are in the right place, mitigation is protected. Now, new construction, they do it a little differently, because if you don't have a building, you don't have to drill a hole in the floor. You can, under the foundation, you can lay in gravel or similar substrates. You can have a horizontal pipe with holes, and it does the same thing. And the nice thing about that, we'll come back to this, is it's much, much cheaper to mitigate a building before you build it than afterward, because you just lay these pipes underneath. They also use membranes, high-density polyethylene or rubber. Those are somewhat effective, but we don't know how long they're effective because we haven't been doing it for that long, and there's always a chance that when you flat membrane, plastic or rubber, but you've got pipes coming from underground, there's always a chance there won't be a good seal. And the thing about gases is they find a hole. And that's one of the reasons you can't just, plugging holes is good, membranes are good, but you can't rely on that. I guess the best way I have to explain that, I was coming home from a vapor intrusion meeting in my own community on my bicycle, and I rolled over a nail, and the nail made a very small hole in the tire, and the tire went flat because there was a pressure gradient. I was sitting on the bicycle. Very little hole, but all the air went out of the tire. Small holes, small openings, or just thin concrete can provide the pathway that the gases need to make it up. So while it's often recommended to seal the joints and put in membranes, it's the sub-slab pressurization system or sub-basement or substructure ventilation that allows you to do that. Now, in some new buildings where they aren't sure that vapor intrusion is likely to occur, but it might, they'll put in these systems and not put a fan on, because you can add a fan later. So you put in the piping, you build the building, and then you sample the air, and if you find a problem, you put a fan on. If you don't, then you rely on this, the wind to pull stuff up to make sure that, to protect people inside. Are there any questions on this? Yeah?
What you just described looks exactly like a mitigation system for radon. And I'm kind of in that business a little bit too, where I see, they say it's about 50% in our area. I think it's more like 70% have higher levels of over 4 picocaries. And I'm just curious if you install that system by a professional, and the EPA set the standard where you have to have silicone, all the pre-cuts and everything that you can access, and they have certain rules, depending on your living space.
Right.
Would that mitigate the other pollutants as well?
Yeah.
Because I know it draws it out.
Although some of the experts have told me that the strength of the fan may have to be stronger for the volatile organic chemicals, because you're dealing with lower concentrations.
So you got to draw it hard, draw it out.
Yeah, and but I'm actually on a committee, and I make these weekly conference calls, and I'm mostly listening with the experts who do this work for both radon and for chemicals. And they're, they spend a half hour. Where should the outlet be for the pipe to make sure that the contamination isn't sucked back into the house? And there's a lot of expertise, but we're always learning more as more and more situations occur. Like, I talked about how this, in cold regions, the vapor intrusion is worst in the winter, what you guys call the heating season, whatever that is. And it's not clear that in California that's the case, or in Texas or Florida. EPA and the Defense Department have two houses, one in Indiana, in Indianapolis, the other in Layton, Utah, where they're fully instrumented. There's no one's living in them, but they've got all kinds of measurement devices. They're constantly measuring the weather, constantly measuring the pressure, the indoor air contamination. And so we're learning a whole lot more in areas that have winter. I would love to see similar studies done in the warmer parts of the country. One of the key things that they've learned in those areas is that indoor air contamination from volatile organic compounds is highly variable over time and space. Using the term temporal variation. That is, the amount of vapors that come up varies diurnally, that is, by every day, varies by season and weather, and it varies by time of year. And, yeah.
What happens if you have your house tested and it's at an all-time low, and then a month from then it goes up and you wouldn't be aware?
And that's a concern. That is, in areas where you know that there's going to be variability, if you don't know you've tested it under the worst case, then you might miss a problem. So one approach is to actually pressurize the house and then depressurize it to generate a worst case. That is, if you depressurize the house, then that should replicate the worst time of year. And then you pressurize it to make sure that it's not coming from inside. So there are ways to overcome that. But historically, this idea of taking a sample once, or maybe twice because you did it during the summer and not during the heating season, the evidence shows that that's not enough. Now, for most chemicals, the way they view it, that pose a long-term chronic risk, you don't have to worry too much. You might take a longer sample because if it's high at one point and low at another point, it'll average out. But when I get to talking about trichloroethylene, you'll see why that's a real concern, exactly the issue that you raised. So one of the things that we often see happen is when you've got a level that's just below the health-based standard, you can either keep sampling several times or put in a mitigation system. It's called preemptive mitigation. And that makes a lot of sense in a lot of places because it's cheaper than doing all the sampling and it protects you against radon. So it's to me it's kind of a no-brainer. We're seeing more and more of that happen, particularly in new construction, where it's even cheaper. You had your hand up?
Yeah, when you talk about polluted groundwater, how far would that travel in an average year? I mean, if you had a site that had polluted groundwater in a year's time, how far would that travel away from that site?
It varies enormously. I tend to think 10 to 100 feet a year. There's a site in Maryland where they have fractured bedrock, basically limestone caves, where the water was just like a river. They had a release and they detected it down in a creek, down gradient almost immediately. So it does vary. In some places it barely moves at all. Now I'm going to come back tap water issues that people are concerned about. Normally, when they sample groundwater, they maybe sample 4 times a year. They have monitoring well, and they take it out 4 times a year, and they measure it. You basically get minor variations. With vapor intrusion, you can have much greater variations over the same time period because of movement of the water table due to rain, barometric pressure, heat differential between inside and outside. All these factors contribute to the variation. And again, these instrumented houses, they have a graph, and it's rather telling. You can also have situations where, particularly if you have a building with distinct rooms, where one room has a lot of contamination and the other doesn't. This has been a concern for me at school sites. But I learned about it at military housing in my community, where we had a row of houses, basically military row houses, and they said, we'll sample the empty apartments so we don't have to bother the residents. And they found contamination in here, and they found another empty apartment and found nothing. And my theory, I call it Russian roulette, is there was a craft in this floor that was collecting gases from the entire building. And so they actually had very high levels in that one place, and perhaps nothing anywhere else. So spatial variation can be important as well. And the underground surface isn't homogeneous. You can have the clay here and sand here, and stuff moves faster through sand than it does through clay. So it turns out that sampling for vapor intrusion is a real challenge because of the variations over time and place. And this is why, increasingly, and this is in EPA's new guidance, we find agencies saying, well, why don't we just mitigate? It's going to protect the people against radon anyhow. The issue that comes up is who pays for it, because normally, if you're just protecting your house against radon, you're paying for it yourself. And in the case of a vapor intrusion site, you're asking the responsible party, the business that caused the pollution in the first place, to pay for it.
How much of a health risk is breathing that?
Well, it depends upon the chemicals, and there are a lot of different chemicals that we deal with when we study vapor intrusion. I'm going to mention just a few of them. The TCE, trichloroethylene, is the one of greatest concern, and it's one of the chemicals you have here. Tetrachloroethylene, dry cleaning chemical, that's also a concern. Okay, thank you. And it's right now, because of EPA's findings about at what level it triggers cancer, the numbers are much higher at the point at which they would have a problem. So TCE tends to be a problem. Petroleum compounds can also be a cause of vapor intrusion, be found in vapor intrusion, but petroleum compounds tend to break down as they come to the surface. They come into contact with oxygen from the surface, and then they break down, they biodegrade, and so you actually see very few sites where petroleum compounds are vapor intrusion issues. There are some where methane is. Methane's also an explosive hazard. But basically, almost all of the places in the country where vapor intrusion is an issue, they're TCE or tetrachloroethylene, which is called PCE. And in some states like California, we still have a stringent standard for PCE. But in many parts of the country, now that EPA has weakened their standard, we don't see as much PCE being addressed as a vapor intrusion issue. The levels have to be a lot higher to be a concern. So TCE is an issue for 2 reasons. One is the exposure standards that US EPA set in, I think it was September 2011, are very low. And secondly, EPA concluded, and the TCE manufacturers challenge this, that TCE may cause birth defects if pregnant risk is described, and usually they lump all cancers together when they do these numbers, but they know which ones are most likely to be caused. The most common cancers associated with exposure to TCE are kidney cancer, liver cancer, and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. But you know, the studies are very hard to do because I can't feed you all TCE and see what happens to you. You have to reconstruct exposure. So some places, at the old Viewmaster plant in Oregon, they did have a whole lot of people who were exposed to TCE through the drinking water pathway. But they found one cancer, women had more, and the other cancer they had less, and it was a reverse for men. So it's really hard to come up with hard and fast health analysis. EPA does the best they can, and no matter what they do, either people like me will challenge them or industry will challenge them based on the results. But EPA found that, well, they use what's called the excess lifetime cancer risk. So 10 to the minus 6, or 1 in a million excess lifetime cancer risks, means if 1 million people are exposed at that level for, they call it a lifetime, I think it's 26 or 30 years, there'll be one more cancer, or maybe one more fatality due to cancer. 10 to the minus 5 means if 100,000 are exposed for that period of time, then there'll be one more cancer. So EPA found in their study that the level, the unit is called micrograms per cubic meter, and that always scares people. But you don't really have to, I don't feel, it's not, I know what a foot is, but I don't know what a microgram per cubic meter looks like. But that's the unit they use. So it's 0.43. That's the number US EPA associates with 1 in a million excess lifetime cancer risk. The one for 1 in 100,000 is 4.3. That's in a residential setting where it's possible that someone will be exposed around the clock. And with vapor intrusion, we actually are often talking about that. People may be exposed around the clock. In an occupational setting, where people are there, 40 hours a week, 50 weeks a year. In my area, they assume 50 hours a week. The occupational exposure standard, instead of 0.43, is about 2, because people are there less often. Of course, that doesn't deal with the fact I have a friend who lived in an area where the house was suspected to have vapor intrusion, and he worked above another building. So that didn't make him feel real comfortable. But that's the way they do it. And so for 1 in 100,000, the 4.3 turns into something around 20 to 25. So if you measure a household that has 1 microgram per cubic meter, you would say that if you're using 10 to the minus 6 as your cancer goal, then that exceeds it and you need to mitigate. The same with occupational. You use the numbers in the same way. In my community, we're using 10 to the minus 6. In New York, they're using 10 to the minus 6. The documents I saw for the Oversight and for the people who are working in the occupational buildings, they are using 10 to the minus 5 as the cancer goal, so that allows more exposure. However, it doesn't go up to 25 about the non-cancer risk. And the non-cancer risk is a set number. It doesn't vary from place to place. So the non-cancer risk number that EPA has for TCE is 2 micrograms per cubic meter in a residential setting and 8.8 in an occupational setting. So that's what they're using for the people who are working on the Hoover property now. So the recent sampling that was done in January found one building, one sample, that was above the 8.8. It was 10. But there were several samples that were above 2, which is if we're using California or New York standard for cancer. So we would require mitigation in all those places. And EPA is not here in Ohio because they're using the non-cancer risks, neurological diseases, for example, Parkinson's. It doesn't always cause it. The toxicologist talks, it's a risk factor. You know, when somebody gets sick, there are genetic reasons, there are multiple exposures to multiple chemicals, and so they say it increased the risks unacceptably. So I've been trying to figure out, my brother died of cancer, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and another cancer with a much longer name last year, that could be associated with exposure to TCE or any one of a number of other chemicals. And I racked my brain going over with him trying to figure out what he might have been exposed to. We never could pin it down. Maybe it wasn't caused by the TCE, but we know TCE is a risk factor that can cause it, so we try to eliminate that risk. But the level of TCE, 2 in a residential setting, 8.8 in an occupational setting, that EPA considers unacceptable for non-cancer risk is associated with cardiac birth defects in babies born to pregnant women who were exposed. And I'm surprised I didn't figure it out for myself. Fortunately, we have toxicologists to explain this sort of thing. And that is, when you talk about cancer, you're talking about exposure over 10, 20, 30 years. But what's the period of exposure that could cause a birth defect? It's got to be less than 9 months. In fact, the toxicologists say, and they don't have the studies, anywhere from 1 day to 3 weeks during the first trimester of pregnancy. So not only you're dealing with a short-term exposure all of a sudden, but also exposure where most women don't know that they're pregnant. Yeah, you could keep women out of all buildings where there's a risk, but that's discrimination. So this is a game changer. So the question that you asked, what if you miss the high level? Well, if you're dealing with a chronic risk and you miss the high level, the average is kind of good enough. But if for a pregnant woman and you miss the high level, and it happens to be the period in which her baby's heart is being formed, then you got a real problem. Now, I've gone on TV in my community because there's a site where there's 4 schools above a contamination plume of TCE, and I said, this is a risk to pregnant women. And the woman got a call from a pregnant teacher the next day. You know, oh my God. And I said, it increases your risk unacceptably. It's something we should deal with. It doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to have a baby with birth defects, but you have a right to know about this risk, so when your baby is born, you can ask your doctor to check for that problem. So it's not that everybody's going to get sick, but this is the level which EPA has established. 2 for residential, 8.8 occupational, at which TCE poses that risk to pregnant women. Yeah.
Because PCE is, very comparable to TCE, can you give us the figures that EPA has most recently for PCE exposure?
Well, basically, instead of 0.43, EPA is using about 8 or 9. So it's 20 times less toxic. California doesn't feel it, but California uses 0.41. So it's a debate. I question the political process that went to the setting of EPA standard, but I don't have the expertise to say that they're wrong. And there are no studies at this point which suggest that PCE causes cardiac birth defects for fetuses that are exposed in utero. I'm hoping at some point they'll do those studies, but right now EPA applies this to TCE and no other chemical.
What about the vinyl chloride that's been found in the dechloroethane?
Well, I was going to come to that later, but I can address it now. Vinyl chloride is as toxic as TCE in drinking water, but we usually don't see it as a vapor intrusion chemical because it's less volatile, and also because, like petroleum, it degrades as it comes into contact with oxygen. So while it's a very serious contaminant for drinking water, it doesn't appear to be a vapor intrusion risk. Now that doesn't mean it couldn't be, it just hasn't. I know of no sites where vinyl chloride exposure is the driving force behind a vapor intrusion response. Now in terms of DCE, DCE is thus far believed to be less toxic. Now DCE is not an industrial chemical, hasn't been studied as much. You know, the best studies that they have for most of these chemicals are large industrial cohorts. That is 10,000 workers working in a plant where TCE is in the air. DCE isn't used in the plant, so we have fewer studies like that. So maybe someday we'll find out it's got a similar problem. Maybe we'll find out the same with PCE. But again, we can't go around exposing people to these chemicals and see what happens to them. So we'll all be dead and gone by the time we really know what's happening to us. Yeah.
So the two main words is water, intrusion or whatever, through the water or through the air, right? So like at the residential and the job site, how many hours, like for this standard, how many hours would I have to be exposed to be at risk?
I believe this is based on 40 hours a week. I don't know whether it's 50 weeks a year. Again, in my community, they use 50 hours because people tend to work, have longer work weeks. And there's a lot of imprecision in this. So some agencies do maybe do 8.4 or 9 instead of 8.8. But 8.8 is the number that's used in the documents here.
From the residential standpoint, what is that?
From the residential standpoint would be 2. 2 micrograms per cubic meter for the non-cancer risk in a residential scenario.
For how many hour exposure?
That's based on 24/7.
Okay, 24/7. And then one other quick question on the drinking water. So like I have a reverse osmosis. I mean, I get city water.
Yeah.
And so I have an RO system
Yeah.
to filter that out. Is that a safe bet to have to take out some of these things if there is anything in the water?
I used to do that too because my dad was worried that I'd be exposed.
Yeah.
And I guess it's belt and suspenders. Your water system isn't supposed to be serving these chemicals to you above the standards. They're supposed to be giving you reports on what's in them. So in theory, you don't need it. If you're worried, it doesn't hurt.
But I mean,
You may waste water.
wouldn't the municipality be responsible to make sure they're putting out decent quality water for the consumers?
Absolutely.
So I think the reading somewhere public, I'm sure.
Yeah, they're supposed to send it to you. Every water system over a certain size is supposed to send out to all its customers
We get that.
their annual sampling results.
It's an annual. We need a guy like you to read it.
Well, I mean, usually what they find is it's not there. That the chemicals aren't there. And there's some notable examples where like at Camp Lejeune, the Marine base in North Carolina, where it was there, and they didn't tell anybody. But they're supposed to, the water purveyors, whether they be private or public, are supposed to deliver that. So the problem becomes more private wells where you don't have a government agency that's supposed to be doing the monitoring. Although some states do require the monitoring of private wells. Now, one of the things that because of the variability, even if let's say you don't accept these lower numbers that we're using in California, let's say you find 7 in one of the buildings that are occupied at the Oversight right now where people are working. That to me is high enough to say, because of the variability, we should do something about it. We could sample it to death while people continue to be exposed, particularly pregnant women, or we could take action to prevent exposure. And to me, because of the relatively low costs in most situations, putting radon-type systems, mitigation systems in to protect people, even if you aren't above the legal threshold, makes a lot of sense. Now, I raised this issue in Endicott, New York. It's one of the larger vapor intrusion sites in the country. But the source area, the old IBM plant, which is now used by BAE, I think it's an aerospace company, they have contamination levels close to the standard, and they aren't mitigating. And the excuse is, well, we've got so much infrastructure and piping and basements that it's actually a lot harder to mitigate than one might think. And that might be true, that sometimes older industrial facilities are hard to mitigate. Some industrial facilities can be mitigated with HVAC systems, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems, that by circulating the air and creating a positive air pressure, then you can keep the contamination from, basically, by increasing the pressure inside the building, you could prevent the contamination from being sucked up. Now, this is what they were doing in my community, the buildings built above the plumes that were left behind by the semiconductor industry. But a couple of years ago, a couple of Google buildings, they actually found unacceptable levels of TCE in the indoor air, and it turned out the HVAC system wasn't working properly. So you can't just assume that because you have an HVAC system that it's going to be protective. And of course, you can't assume that because there's an HVAC system that it's always going to be running at the level necessary to be protective. I mean, after all, we are trying to save energy and not, run these systems all the time. So there are things you can do to mitigate other than the radon-type systems, ventilation and pressurization, and those are things that have to be done on a site-specific basis. But whenever you do mitigation, and I think it's been true for radon, you need to do follow-up sampling. You have to make sure that if you have a radon system, like a manometer, little tube, looks like a U-shaped tube, to make sure that the pressure differential is being maintained properly. And you have to sample every once in a while to make sure that the indoor air is meeting its goals. And there's a lot of debate about how often is enough, but anytime you install these kinds of systems, you can't assume that they're going to do the job. So a friend of mine who has a dirt basement, they put in one fan, it was supposed to ventilate her basement, and actually increase the contamination when they did the follow-up sampling. Because it was pulling contamination from below, the mitigation was only successful when they put a second fan in to bring in air from outside. So again, you can't assume that these systems are always going to work and protect people, but if you have a comprehensive program of follow-up sampling and maintenance, you can be protected.
A long time ago, I had my basement mitigated using the method you showed for the drawing there, and I had not had it retested, but they told me they marked a line with a pencil on near the tubing, and they said as long as this is at this line, it's okay. Now, should I have that retested?
I might. I mean, it's probably okay, but let's say, well, again, in my house, I put holes in the floor. And so the pressurization that might have worked before might not be enough based upon the new situation in your house. Now, radon is much more constant than groundwater that's flowing. So there's perhaps less need, but there, it might not hurt. Since radon testing is so cheap, to check every once in a while to make sure that you're protected.
Now, should you have that tested in the winter, you think? Or is there a particular time where...
In this part of the country, I believe the experts would recommend sampling in the winter because that's when you've got the greatest stack effect, sucking up the contamination. In other parts of the country where they run the air conditioners more in the summer, I listen to the experts discuss this, and there are always exceptions. But as a rule, winter with a kit is an easy way to measure radon. And some people say, one way if you have a system and it's protecting you against radon, you're probably protected against any VOCs under your house. They can't say for sure. Way back there.
If at the Hoover property there are chemicals, those VOCs, that may be at a higher level or borderline, like you said, 7 below the 8.8, so what else? Let's say there are some chemicals there. Whose responsibility is it to mitigate it if it's recommended or a good idea?
place for liability is the entity or its descendant that was responsible for the release. So I mentioned in my community, and I'm going to show you a map of it in a little while, we had Fairchild Semiconductor, the birthplace of the semiconductor industry. And Fairchild was bought by Schlumberger, a French company, I don't know, in the 1980s. And they didn't do very well, and they sold off Fairchild, and all they ended up with was the liability for the contamination. And Schlumberger is paying for the cleanup. When you have drilling holes in the floor, a new building, HVAC systems, very often the current property owner will handle a lot of the costs, particularly in new construction. And sometimes they'll go to court and try to get the original polluter or responsible party to pay. And sometimes that responsible party has disappeared. You know, the company's gone away and or doesn't have any money. So then the landowner becomes responsible. That creates a problem for the off-site situation. So you can say, okay, the current owner of the property is the one who's redeveloping it. They're responsible for handling the problem on-site, but they didn't cause the problem off-site. So who takes responsibility for that? And sometimes it's by a government agency, sometimes you go back and you look for the companies that caused the problem in the first place. But that's why a lot of places actually don't get cleaned up. Now mitigation's easier than cleanup. Cleanups can be really expensive. But mitigation, you know, you can often get somebody to pay because the cost is so low. You know, in the order of thousands or tens of thousands of dollars and not millions of dollars that cleaning up a large groundwater plume would entail. So I want to just talk about oh, sir.
Just a quick question with regard to the multiple ownerships of the same facility over there. With the transfer of ownership, doesn't the new owner assume the legacy costs associated with the facility that they purchased?
It's rather complicated. If in the deal they agree to that, then they may take over that responsibility. I'm not a lawyer, so under federal law, what are called brownfields, which are former industrial properties.
With respect to former steel mills that were shut down, and EDS permits go in the river, that legacy cost of the discharge to the navigable waterway is the responsibility of the current owner of the facility.
I'll say it. Again, in my community, the current owners are not going to clean up because Intel still has money and Schlumberger has money, so they can be held accountable. But the concept of brownfields is to get places cleaned up or mitigated by the new owner because they're going to make money off the redevelopment of the property. So that's the second place you go for the money. And then oftentimes you'll have lawsuits between them about who's responsible for what. But when somebody buys contaminated property, they're supposed to have phase 1 environmental assessments, phase 2 assessments, and they're responsible for a certain level of cleanup, but not necessarily dealing with the whole problem. And when there's a big problem, there's sort of a gap, and we end up with contamination remaining in the ground forever. But they are responsible for making sure that people aren't exposed. That's my understanding of the law. Yeah.
What about us as residents? If we sell our house, are we required to disclose this problem?
That's a state issue. I don't know what it is. I know in California there's a disclosure requirement that when you're signing your closing documents, you've got 100 pieces of paper. About page 50 tells you that there might be contamination. In New York, I've been told by a friend who has a vapor intrusion mitigation system in her house that people routinely ignore the requirement and end up paying a $500 penalty because they figure they're saving money that way. But I don't know what Ohio's requirement is.
7 years ago, and it was not disclosed to me, but apparently the problem was still there at that time. So if I were to sell my house tomorrow, now that I'm more aware, am I required or?
I don't know what the law is, but it may be that the agencies have concluded that there is no risk. There may be contamination underground, but it's not at sufficient levels coming up that it's a risk. You might not be required to dispose. Now, when you have a situation like, let's say the industrial buildings, and the school buildings are a real big one for me, I think it's really important to tell people whatever you know, even if it's not required. So the school I visited in North Carolina ended up being closed because it had contamination underneath it, did not have unacceptable levels inside. But when the parents found out about it, they assumed because they hadn't been told that it was really dangerous, and they insisted that the schools be closed. And they were closed without scientific justification by the school board. So when you don't tell people stuff, you create all kinds of problems. So I always advocate disclosure, that not only do you do mitigation, you do long-term maintenance and monitoring, but you do notification. And the people who work in these buildings should know the risk. The pregnant women should say, people have a right to make decisions and say, well, I've run across lots of people. My son has a really unusual disease. I don't want him exposed to this, even though the government says it's safe. And if you don't tell them about that, you aren't honoring their personal risk management decisions. But again, I can't tell you what the legal requirements are here in Ohio. Do you?
I was just going to say, like, I can't speak for the plume or anything, but as far as, mitigation for radon, when you're a buyer, there's always a caveat out there, buyer beware. But if the seller has actual knowledge of something, they're supposed to disclose it. If they have, not hearsay, but actual knowledge, then they usually disclose that in disclosure. But as a buyer, there's a, due diligence part with checking the radon levels, like it's not that expensive to do. So if they check it and the levels are 4 picocuries or higher, then it was recommended to be mitigated, and then you negotiate who mitigates it. Usually it's, the seller.
Is there a penalty for not disclosing?
No, it's just, what happens is, like, let's say, if I have actual knowledge, then you need to disclose that, for a liability standpoint. But if you do check it, and let's say it's close to the level, let's say it's 4.1, and the level here is 4 or above, and I feel, well, that's not right, I'm paying all this money to mitigate for one little adjustment. So it's just a matter of, negotiating, and if I do choose not to do it, the buyer walks and says, I'm not buying it, then you don't fix it or mitigate it, then you have an obligation to disclose that so that it's public for the next party that comes in. That's how it works in the real estate side. But I'm not an attorney, so you'd have to check with an attorney to see if, on that particular claim thing or whatever.
When I'm talking about these chemicals, and this will be important for discussing the off-site plume. This is ethene, 2 carbons and 4 hydrogens. I'm not sure I've drawn it right. I never took a course in organic chemistry, but I looked it up on the Wikipedia. And this is tetrachloroethylene. So instead of hydrogen, it has 4 chlorines attached to the 2 carbons in the middle. Tetra, 4. Trichloroethylene, guess how many chlorines it has? 3. Dichloroethylene has 2. There are 2 forms where the chlorines are on the same side or they're across from each other. And then vinyl chloride has 1 chlorine. So there's a chemical process aided by bacteria that's called reductive dechlorination. So when these chemicals are found in groundwater and there's a source of carbon, and often they inject lactose or molasses or something like that. There's a source of carbon. The bugs in the soil, the microorganisms, will chew off the chlorines, and you end up with fewer chlorines. So what starts out as tetrachloroethylene becomes trichloroethylene and becomes dichloroethylene, becomes vinyl chloride, and then sometimes it stops and you've got a lot of vinyl chloride, and that's a problem because vinyl chloride is considered as toxic or more toxic than TCE. Or there's oxygen and it breaks down into ethene, which is not considered a These chemicals tend to degrade under the right conditions in the groundwater and soil. One of the chemicals that causes this breakdown to accelerate, to happen rapidly, at least getting down to vinyl chloride, one of the chemicals is petroleum. And at least one of the documents I read about the Oversight suggests that the volatile, or the chlorinated compounds, the ones I've been talking about, are found in groundwater with petroleum at the same place. And when you have that, and this is in my community, we had a gas station, a former Navy gas station that was leaking gasoline that mixed with the TCE and it caused it to break down. And that may be what's happening here, because as you move to the west from the source areas at the Hoover site, you see a decline in PCE, then you have TCE, then you have DCE, and then you have vinyl chloride. And it's called natural attenuation, breaking down naturally. And that may save people in the homes or reduce the risk of vapor intrusion, because DCE isn't considered as toxic as TCE, and vinyl chloride tends not to be drawn up into homes without degrading. So the data that I've seen, and it's old data, showing the plumes, that very few buildings off the site are above substantial levels of TCE. So that's a little bit of background on that.
I have a question.
Yeah.
When the vapors go up into the building, they become dangerous.
Yeah.
When those same vapors are mitigated to the exterior
Yeah.
of the building, out into the air, why are they less dangerous out there? Is it because of the oxygen?
It's because, well, TCE I know has a half-life of 3 to 7 days, and it may vary by climate. But basically it breaks down in the air, but it also is diluted and blown away, so that it's much less of a risk. Now I contend that the level of TCE that's found in the outdoor air in most American metropolitan areas is still unsafe. It's actually not our worst air pollutant. So it shouldn't be there. 0.2 micrograms per cubic meter, that's still a health risk. It's 1/2 of the 10, it's 5 times 10 to the -7 excess lifetime cancer risk. So it shouldn't be there, but diesel exhaust is more of a problem in the outdoor air. So it's not that it totally goes away, but it becomes so low that we have other things to focus on. So in my community, we have new developments going in. People saying, well, how about the parks? Kids play in the parks. Well, the concentrations you're going to find in the air above the park is not as much of a problem as when it's kept confined in a building.
Lenny, when you just mentioned a minute ago about the attenuation as it moved off-site, was that information you derived that conclusion from based on the 2 monitoring wells that 4 PhDs have questioned that they were improperly screened in the aquifer so that the data could be flawed?
Well, there were several monitoring wells. Dr. Rice at Ohio State has raised the question about whether they're measuring the water at the right depth. That's not the only problem. The problem is particularly for vapor intrusion, there weren't enough wells and there hasn't been recent sampling. Paul Johnson was kind of the guru of vapor intrusion. Once gave a talk at a conference I organized. He says it's dark down there. We don't really know what's going on down under the ground. We sample here, there, and there, and we try to figure out what's going on. So the site that I've been talking about where the school was closed in North Carolina, they thought that the contamination was going down because in the upper aquifer, groundwater is many levels, the upper aquifer was going down. But it turned out in the lower aquifer it wasn't being reduced by the cleanup, and it was actually coming up. Downgrade, it's coming up under the school. And they actually had increasing levels of contamination. And unless you do follow-up sampling in the long run, you never know that the trend that you thought you spotted 15 years ago is still true. So it's not just a matter of whether they measured it right, but they didn't measure it in enough places over a long enough time to know that there's no TCE under the homes. The data we have says people might be okay. Now, my response is you can do a rather thorough groundwater sampling. And you have reasons to do that because you're concerned about how this plume and other contamination from the Oversight might affect your drinking water supplies. But it's actually fairly cheap to get a $200 or $500 sorbent device and put it in a home and determine whether you have excess levels of TCE inside. And if you find it, then you can go look for the gun cleaner. Or you can, all the things you can do to determine whether that's coming from below. But you don't need to do this exhaustive multi-year groundwater sampling to check to see whether the air is safe. Now, a lot of agencies historically have been reluctant to start with indoor air sampling. Communities say, well, why don't we just measure what we're breathing instead of measuring something else and doing a whole bunch of calculations and interpolation to figure out whether it's okay. So it might be something that people who live in that area might want is, you know, we'd love to see you do the comprehensive groundwater sampling, and you're definitely going to need it to look at the impact on the municipal water supply. But why don't you just sample the air in our homes, some of our homes, to let us know whether there's a potential exposure. And of course that's, again, you might measure the wrong time, but at least it's an indication of the problem. So I was going to talk about some of these issues. This is the MEW Regional Groundwater Plume, Mountain View, California. I've been working on it since 1981 as a community activist. And I'm working on vapor intrusion since 2002. My friend Jane lives in a purple house right here. And I made it, it's a little bit bigger than it would be on the map. And Jane said, she and I were going to meetings with EPA and the polluters. And said, I'd like my house sampled. I've got a young son. I'd like my house sampled. So we're just talking about, why can't you just sample the indoor air? No, the plume boundary is right here down the middle of Wisman. It's called the Middlefield Ellis Wisman Superfund site because this is Middlefield, this is Wisman, and this is Ellis. This is US 101. This is Fairchild, Intel, Raytheon. Today it's Google and Symantec, who has successfully redeveloped the problem. And said, no, we don't need to sample. Here's the plume boundary, you're across the street. Finally, they sampled and they found out her son had been breathing unacceptable levels of TCE in his bedroom. And part of it was because she has a dirt basement, which is more susceptible than a slab-on-grade house. So we had a meeting of our community advisory board, and we said, well, how could this be? She's outside the plume. And they said, well, actually, we measured 1 here and 50 here, so here's 5. 5 is the boundary, 5 parts per billion is the boundary of the plume. So it turns out that the number of monitoring wells you need to do to sample the groundwater in the upper aquifer, the water which is potentially going to cause vapor intrusion, they need to be a lot more densely packed than if you're trying, we were just trying to protect a drinking water well down here. And for that, whether the line was here or here, it didn't matter. But for Jane, it really mattered. So the number of wells that you look at in the 2003 corrective measures study for the Oversight doesn't strike me as enough wells to determine the potential for vapor intrusion, even though the data as they present it and the way they draw the lines based on a handful of monitoring wells, and as Chris said, perhaps sunk to the wrong depths, makes it look like the stuff degrades and it's not that big of a problem. If I lived in that area, I'd want more data before saying I'm okay. arm of the plume, a widening of the plume, which is, you know, we had 1 million parts per billion in places originally. This is a very, you know, a whole lot of contamination, multiple depths. And so, I don't know, about 3 years ago, they sampled here. Because they hadn't sampled in this little area here. And lo and behold, they found a hot spot. Now, they used a new method of high-resolution sampling, which perhaps came up with a larger, a higher quantity of pollution, higher concentration of TCE in groundwater than they might have found. But basically, they found that it was beyond the plume boundary. Now, then they found a hot spot over here. This is called Evandale Avenue. And they found a couple more hot spots. And I went to a meeting and said, that's interesting. Why are you getting these hot spots here? Particularly because you have what seems like a clean area here between the main plume and the hot spots. Okay. Where does the sewage line go? And they came back with a map. Well, the sewage line happens to go right here. But then the city said, well, actually, the sewer line doesn't flow this way anymore. It flowed, you know, back in 1966, we built another sewage line, and the contamination from Fairchild goes up across under the freeway. And so just earlier this year, EPA completed a study, and they concluded that a sewage line that was closed in 1966 was responsible for these hot spots. The documents for the corrective measures study for the Oversight says they believe that the contamination west of the property has been intercepted by a sewer line and or storm drain. They said it's probably not most of the contamination, and probably most of it is degraded, but there's somehow contamination has gotten into that sewer line. Did that sewer line spread the contamination? A friend of mine is an expert with the Santa Clara Valley Water District. He's written, you know, books on this subject. He says when this kind of contamination gets into a sewer line, and there's sort of a joint or a dip in the line, TCE is heavier than water, and it can sink to the bottom, acidify, and you don't even need the hydrochloric acid that they also pour down the drain to poke a hole in there. So that's what they think these hot spots are. So to assure people that that a major plume of contamination is not spreading through preferential pathways, you need to investigate these kinds of issues. So when I called up Dr. Rice, and this is not my area of expertise, she's a geologist, she works with hydrogeologists at Ohio State. She told me that there are all kinds of holes under the ground around here, from coal mining, from clay excavation, old infrastructure, that you can't just take a few samples and assume everything is flowing in the same direction. You have preferential pathways which move things in directions you don't expect. I mean, a lot of places in the country where you have subterranean sand channels, and so, you know, streams flow like this. And so if something makes it into one of those subterranean sand channels, used to be a stream, you know, a million years, I don't know how long ago, it's going to flow along that way and sometimes flow backward, you think. You've got to find those things to make sure you've captured exactly where the contamination is going. So particularly because you have a concern that the contamination might be flowing north or west towards your municipal wells, there needs to be much more exhaustive analysis of where things are flowing underground. For vapor intrusion, you need to know it, but you also need to know it for even if you're convinced that everything's degrading and not going to be coming up into people's homes, one still needs to figure out where the contamination is flowing, because there's enough of it that it's not just going to go away immediately. It may be that things are okay, but one needs to do much more sampling than they did back in 2000, 2001, when they signed. It seemed like, you know, there may be a half a dozen wells to the west of the property. That to me, you know, would be the logical thing to do. The question is getting somebody to pay for it. If, you know, actually for this, the companies that used to be here, Schlumberger, Intel, they said, well, look, we'll clean up this spot, but we don't admit responsibility for it. And there was a spot over here with a similar thing that was found 30 years ago. They did the same thing. We don't admit responsibility. Out of the goodness of our heart, we will clean it up. And they aren't too happy. The EPA basically said, this is now part of the Superfund site, and you're responsible for it. But they are. As far as, you know, the science, the investigation that EPA has been doing suggests that that contamination was released by the companies that were operating here.
If you have like 500 parts per billion of the TC, PCE 20 feet down under homes, because of the differential, and again, I understand the seasonal variation from the frozen ground and so forth, but you're talking about the upward effect pulling in through cracks, maybe sump pumps if they have private wells and so forth. If you have 500 ppb 20 feet down in sand and gravel, let's say, would you anticipate the amounts in the indoor air because the differential would be greater?
It's very hard numerically, quantitatively, to predict what you're going to find in indoor air as a result of a groundwater sample. The groundwater sample, to me, says you should sample the indoor air because the way the building is built may keep all of the contamination from coming inside, or it may make it real easy for it to come inside. But I advocate a vapor intrusion investigation any place where you've got more than 5 parts per billion in the shallowest groundwater. I'm not sure how deep, you know, New Mexico, it's 500 feet deep, probably not worried about that. Yeah, 20 feet, 50 feet, that's a reason for investigation. It's easier to do a model that takes the soil gas and predicts what's inside, but the sampling that's been done in these houses in Utah and Indiana suggests that that's not real work. And so you end up having to use a rather protective ratio, it's called an attenuation factor, to decide whether to go inside. But I've always argued, and what EPA has done in my communities, if you suspect indoor air contamination, measure indoor air contamination. And then, and a lot of the scientists are coming around on this, the EPA guide is coming around on this, if you find it inside, then you go back to the multiple lines of evidence to determine whether what you found inside is actually coming from the subsurface. So yes, at that level, 500, you'd definitely be suspicious that there's a problem inside.
Those were in soil gases, they were in water.
So soil gas numbers, people tend to get scared when they see soil gas, let's say 1,000 micrograms per cubic meter, and the standard is, you know, as I said, 0.5 or 5 micrograms per cubic meter, 8. And, you know, that 1,000 sounds high, but the contamination attenuates when the soil gas comes inside. So typically 1,000 may end up 1,000 in the subsurface may end up being 0.1 inside, but it could also be 100 inside. So the solution is to sample the indoor air. It's the most direct measurement of what people might be exposed to, knowing that you may have to do extra work to find out, once you find the contamination, whether it's coming from below or the can of gun cleaner or plastic cement that's in the house.
Do you have to have a groundwater plume, or can you have in the vadosome, and say it's sand, gravel, frozen ground, can the gases move through the soil particles, the space you talked about preparation?
Yeah. So if you had the actual site where contamination was released, then contamination in the soil can off-gas the same way that the groundwater can.
So you don't have to have a plume
But if you're talking about a residential property that's off-site, then it's got to be coming from the groundwater, unless somebody went out and poured a can of TCE in their backyard. That has happened. Yeah.
Lenny, on the indoor, like I think the simplest solution, if I'm curious about my indoor air quality as a residential person, there's got to be a machine I can rent or buy or pick up somewhere to test it for a few days.
A friend of mine has a company in Palo Alto, and I'm sure there are others around.
Is there a website for that?
It's called Terradex, TERRADEX.com. And just for disclosure, he's on my board of my nonprofit. But we both came at it from the same place. And they actually will provide mail order sorting devices similar to what EPA uses. I think probably, I don't know, between $200 or $500 a pop. I always recommend you try to get the polluters to pay you the cost. But if you want to know and you can afford it, this is a way to pursue it. Yeah.
Is that the SUMA canister you're talking about?
Now, this is a sorbent device, a little tube. And, turns out, I was at a conference and there are multiple kinds of sorbent devices. And some of them are good for doing a quick study, and some are better for doing a 2-month study. But the Terradex, I know, is designed for people who just want to know what's in their home. And it's not the SUMA canister. EPA at my site, at the WW Plume I was showing you, actually did a study comparing the results of the sorbent devices and the SUMA canisters, and found out they were comparable. I think the SUMA canisters are more exact. I think you can study for more chemicals with it. I'm not sure about that. The SUMA canister goes to a lab and they go through the whole list of analytes, whole list of chemicals. I think that maybe the sorbent device is more limited, as are some of the real-time. So you have to know what
Who does the SUMA canister? Is that something you order, or is that something that someone rent off?
You really need a professional consulting firm to do that for you.
And if there is a problem in someone's home or business, and you need to mitigate, what type of expense are you looking at for something like that?
Well, mitigation can be $5,000 or $10,000. It's the same. It's basically the same as a radon system. But again, I go to these conferences. There's a guy from EPA in Boston who did a little slideshow for us, and he went into he showed a picture of somebody's basement, which looked like my basement. I don't have TCE in my basement, so I don't have to worry about this. It was packed with stuff. And so there was an enormous cost in clearing all the junk out of the basement and, fixing the wall and all that stuff. Actual installation of the mitigation system wasn't that expensive. But again, I don't know if you folks have basements, but my guess is most of them are empty.
What precipitated this now, Lenny? I mean, why are you here? What precipitated this concern? I mean, the Hoover company's been here forever. It's been bought up. Was there an incident? What happened?
Well, Chris has been sending me stuff for years about this, and I remember once submitting a request to EPA for information, and they said I have to pay for it, so I kind of let it slide. And I think I saw a press release from the developer for this site, and basically, actually this is where I was going to go back to. Particularly when you're building residential on one of these contaminated properties. A lot of people say, you can't do it. I'm on the city council back home, and I'm saying you can't do it. I'm telling you, I'm going on the news and saying, we've looked at it, we've studied it, and we have the proper safeguards in place to make sure that when people move in, they aren't going to be exposed to the chemicals. But the proper safeguards have to be in place. My city has a policy that in certain parts of town, anytime you come in for a building permit, you have to comply with EPA's policy for mitigation based on that site. And so that it triggers mitigation, built-in mitigation for those sites that are directly above the contamination. It's actually tiered. If you go and there's less contamination, you go away from the contamination, you may be able to put in a passive system that you put a fan on later, but you have to put the perforated pipes under the building, do the membranes, all these things that are required for new construction. And not only that, you do the construction, you have a plan in place for operation, maintenance, and monitoring to make sure that the fans continue to operate. The people, a lot of people, parts of the country, they don't, they buy a house and it's got a system in, they unplug it. They don't know what it is. It's using a little bit of electricity. Well, there needs to be a system to make sure that the mitigation systems keep operating. You need to monitor. It's not clear how often you need to monitor. Different states have different rules as to how often you monitor, whether you monitor the pressure versus monitoring the indoor air, how that mixes together. It really depends upon the site, what makes the most sense. And then you need a system of notification so that anybody who moves into a building knows that something has been done to protect them from the contamination. Because they might decide, well, my family has a high risk of cancer historically, we'd rather go someplace else.
So again, what's brought you here this evening is that you heard of the development that's going on over there. It wasn't something, numbers that concerned whatever triggered anything was the same as it has been, but the development spurred your interest to come here.
And I only received the numbers, the recent sampling on site within the last week. So it's the development, and my funding comes from EPA's brownfields program. And the purpose of the brownfields program is to make property clean enough so that people can reuse it, and to use the redevelopment of the property to pay for additional cleanup. Because a lot of sites around the country are just sitting dormant with contamination, and the original polluters aren't doing anything, the regulators don't have the resources to deal with it. And so the idea is that with redevelopment, you get cleaner property, and you get the reuse, you get jobs, you get homes. And this is what I've been doing in my community. But you got to do it very carefully, and the first step is for the people in the community to understand these rather complex risks. So going back to the original risks, you do have a risk that I don't know enough about, that this underground contamination may be flowing toward your drinking water supplies. And the fact that it's breaking down into vinyl chloride may reduce the vapor intrusion risk, but it doesn't reduce the risk of drinking it.
What is have you been in contact with our EPA then?
I've had one conversation with US EPA. US EPA is the regulator for most of the Hoover property. There's one building there which is under the jurisdiction of Ohio EPA.
And what's their stance on the condition of the threat, risk of?
They think more sampling needs to be done on the property. They are not focusing at this point on the off-site areas. They're focusing on the actual Hoover site.
And what was it on the flyer? I believe it said something Stark County issue to health risk.
Other people know more about it. But basically, there's a line on the map that includes the Hoover property, or a perimeter on the map that includes the Hoover property and the residential area to the west, where in 2000 or 2001 they documented groundwater contamination moving from the property. And then this is important, essential but insufficient, that they want to make sure that nobody is drilling private wells and drinking the water from that area. And that's important, but it doesn't necessarily deal with the long-term issue. Again, I rely on one conversation with Dr. Rice from Ohio State, but this is something that the cities around here have to do, is they have to go back and assess the threats to their drinking water. And the Hoover site isn't the only one. There's lots of contamination in the old industrial area coming from multiple sources. And it's the responsibility of the agencies that provide that water to do exhaustive sampling to make sure not just that people aren't drinking the bad water. And most agencies are pretty good about that. It's catching it before it gets to that point and they have to find an alternate source of water.
So we have several still mills in the area here that are now out of business and with probably a lot higher contamination factors. Are you visiting any of those, or says it again? I'm just curious why here.
My specialty, what I'm funded to do actually by EPA is vapor intrusion. Now, 2 years ago, I was funded to do other forms of contamination. I had to go to Hawaii because in Kauai there's an old sugar mill that had herbicide and pesticide contamination. It wasn't a vapor intrusion issue. I was able to help those people. But my current funding and my expertise is primarily in the area of vapor intrusion because it's been a big issue in my community for 13 years. So there are other issues. Chris has asked questions about potential radiation emanating from the Hoover site. I have very little expertise in radiation. I have to bring in somebody else to help me understand the numbers for radiation.
So where do we go from here then, Lenny? What's next for us?
Well, I think it'd be worth meeting with the people in the community, meeting with EPA, having them explain what they're requiring at the Hoover site. But basically, this is how I started. There are 4 questions. First one is your tap water. And you have to make sure that the analysis of the drinking water supply here is up to date with what's known about the underground contamination. This is the kind of thing people at Ohio State work on. I think they just did a document for Canton, and it's something that needs to be done periodically to make sure that your drinking water sources remain safe. Not just that your drinking water is safe, but you kind of catch the problems before they get to the wells. Secondly, for the existing, it's my hope that people here will raise with EPA the fact, say, or make sure that the people who are working in those buildings know that their air isn't safe enough for California or Massachusetts. That while there's one hit above the 8.8, there are multiple hits above the level that we'd be concerned about for cancer. And they're close enough that women who are pregnant should know about it. And I would suggest that I don't know whether EPA would require it, but they should put mitigation systems into the existing buildings or do something like HVAC systems to reduce the concentrations. EPA is working on that, and Joe Kelly is the project manager. I talked to him. Now that EPA has their new final vapor intrusion guidance out, he's in a better position to make requirements, but it makes it easier for him when he knows that the community cares, and particularly that the people who work in these buildings are informed that there is a potential risk. It's not a huge risk in the sense that the numbers are marginal, like not people aren't going to go to work and keel over from illness, but they have a right to know that there's contamination there that's, in one instance, above the standard, and again, EPA is requiring more sampling. In terms of new construction, most of the documents do recommend some form of mitigation for new construction at the Hoover site. But I would go to your city government. I guess there's some people who are here or were here from the city government. The city should require that any redevelopment include a site management plan to ensure that vapor intrusion doesn't occur in the new buildings. You're actually doing the developers a big service by doing that, because if they follow the kinds of standards that EPA requires, and my community is backed up, they're probably protecting themselves against litigation, because they're ensuring that people aren't exposed to these chemicals. And finally, there's the off-site area, and I would, your choices are, if you live in that area, there's a daycare, there's a preschool, a daycare center over there. Even though the threat is primarily to pregnant women and not to young children, I might ask somebody to sample the air. Figure out the best time to sample it. Usually that's the winter. Now's not a good time, but to do sampling. And if they find something, to have maybe more exhaustive sampling. But again, the people have a right to know. And it's a big problem, because when you tell people something that's been hidden from them, then they get mad that you had hidden it from them. But at some point they might find out, so you're better off telling them sooner, and hopefully not running into the Winston-Salem, North Carolina situation, where they closed the school when the science didn't justify it. People were so upset.
Joe Kelly, and I was concerned in particular about Panera Bread coming in, and he informed me that he was not involved in, as part of the EPA, in negotiations with Panera Bread, but there was the issue of the new construction, and I had asked, was a vapor barrier going to go in? And he said, well, we're working on this, we're testing, and we really don't know whether we're going to require that. And I said, well, you can't wait till it's built and then go back and say, oh, by the way, Panera, you need to put in a vapor barrier. And so it sort of lingered for several months, and then it said in the paper that Panera Bread could not come to any negotiations with somebody, IRG, someone, and so they've decided not to build there. And I was just concerned, even though they had city water, what if I go in and there's a leak in that city pipe and it's in an air, a plume, is there, a risk? And he wasn't able to answer that, but he said he was still working. And that was good that maybe now Panera Bread, a restaurant that I might have gone to, isn't going to be there. So people have said, well, maybe that no drill zone is no longer valid. So I called Randy Wiskowski at the health department in Canton, and he said it is from 2001 or 2002, but it is still valid in that we've not been told to drop it. We haven't done any testing lately to say we have to have it, but we've not been told not to have it.
You'd have to do testing to show that you don't need it, not just not have testing to show that you need it.
Yeah, so he's just saying it's still valid, it's a no-drill zone.
Yeah, so just one thing about water pipes as opposed to sewage pipes and storm drains, and that is that they're pressurized. So if they have a leak, the contamination of the groundwater doesn't get into the water supply. The water goes the other way. So you don't have to worry about it getting into the water supply from that kind of leak, as you do with sewage lines and storm drains. I believe the community, and this is based, and part of the problem is land use decisions are made by the municipality, and environmental decisions are made by either the state or federal regulatory agency, EPA in either case here, that there's a disconnect. And you have to make sure that the two are working together. And it's not just in the interest of public health and the health of the employees, but if you have a good system in place, then maybe employers and stores and homes that you want on the property will be able to build there because you have a system for ensuring that everything is done safely. And that's what I've been working for in my community. I'm not, LinkedIn says they don't want housing on the property that they just bought. They spent a hell of a lot of money for it, and they're saying because it's contaminated. And they said, wait a minute, you're proposing podium construction. You're going to put a parking lot underneath it. You're going to remove all the contamination. That's not a reason to not have housing. So the community can make good land use decisions when they have a system in place for ensuring that people won't be exposed. And even though it's very hard to clean up this contamination to reach the groundwater standards, and it's very hard to know what's going on down there, what we've learned from radon is we can keep people from breathing unsafe levels of air in their homes and workplaces.
I wanted to add the reason why the radon is a concern is because the Ohio EPA back in 1993 required Hoover, in order to obtain a permit, a closure permit for some pad, they had them do a look-see, and they got, if my memory serves me correctly, in some of the wells, the beta radiation was up to almost 600 picocuries. The federal EPA cutoff, I believe, is still 50. The alpha radiation was around 210 in one of the wells. And so, and the cutoff, the federal cutoff is 15. And I believe, Chuck, isn't this correct, that even the phase 1 report that the current owner had conducted in around 2007 raised radon as a potential concern. And they even, in there, the gentleman wanted to know why this is being brought up now. Back in that same phase 1 report, there was a discussion by the consultant for the current owner, and I'm paraphrasing, that they were talking about the off-site businesses and the residents, and they mulled over, and I think I'll applauded him, but I don't think anything has developed from that. We don't know for sure, and that's why we're asking all these questions now. But back in 2007 era, they were actually mulling over maybe proactively conducting indoor air testing in some of the businesses and residences. They themselves, raised this, but then again, people over the years since then have asked, has this ever been done? Are they continuing to monitor the groundwater? We found out from 4 PhDs that the wells appeared to be incorrectly screened to intercept the plume leaving the site off-site west. So all these various issues on the vapors and the groundwater have languished many, many years. And so that's why we're here tonight, is because of the press release that Chuck got from David Hell, the mayor, informing, and I don't know if it got in the repository, but Chuck got a copy of it from the mayor a few weeks ago, that Hoover is having to do additional, the owner is having to do additional testing, apparently because of the final vapor intrusion guidelines that took 10 years or whatever since 2002 to write. They finally finalized them, and so now they're having to respond to these new guidelines. That's pretty much why we're here.
And EPA has jurisdiction over the site, most of the site, under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, Corrective Action Program, and there's been a voluntary program, but it gets rather complicated because you're dealing with what's called a volunteer, an entity that didn't cause the pollution. And you don't want to be punitive to the volunteer. On the other hand, you want to make sure people are safe. And it's very tricky to find the right level of regulation to ensure that something gets done and they don't just walk away from the site and let the contamination stay. A couple that you would need.
When the vapor moves, does the whole thing move or just part of it? And is there anything left behind?
Vapor comes off of groundwater or comes out of soil, comes up a little at a time. So it doesn't all come up at once. It also, one thing I've talked about, how groundwater generally moves in one direction, sort of it's going downhill above the bedrock or whatever's, the clay, whatever's down there. Normally, the gases move in every direction. For about 100, if it's TCE, they figure about 100 feet, depending on how well they've measured the groundwater. So what happens is that some of these large reservoirs of contamination, some of which is dissolved in the groundwater, some of which has sunk to the bottom of the groundwater, some of which is sorbed to the soil, that it will continue releasing for a long period of time. So, with a large plume, and I don't actually know the quantity of what was released here, but typically the concentrations that you're seeing at the maximum area suggest that it's not going to deplete anytime soon. Although you do see, it's conceivable that as stuff moves away, that you will see less of TCE and more of these other contaminants.
So in other words, it's not moving, it's spreading.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do you explain the wild card of this pollution source isn't done polluting or releasing contaminants? And the reason I ask is I worked for the Hoover Company in the early 80s and I had a job there as a planning analyst. And one of the projects I worked on was do we
someday the corrosion happens and all of a sudden there's a belated release. That's what happened at this site in Maryland. It's an Army base in Maryland, as far as we know. This was pretty common in industrial America, that things were disposed of improperly. In some cases, people knew they were doing it wrong. In other cases, they had no, they had no idea when I was there. When I was a teenager, I would throw my motor oil on a dusty area, would pull down the dust, and I didn't realize there was contamination in it. Some of these things happen for that reason. You find these things a lot, these kinds of waste areas, a lot of places. And so again, some of it was done knowingly, and some of it was done innocently. I'm not sure that answers you, but
Well, I mean, you can't really start over analyzing every day in case something, changes big time.
But the way our laws work is the entities that caused those releases are responsible for them, whether or not they knew they were doing something wrong at the time. Yeah.
How large an area are we talking about when we say Hoover and West?
Can someone help me with that?
What was the question?
How far west does
It goes to Hillcrest. 5th Street, the north end, Hillcrest, and it kind of comes down to an angle, includes the just this side of the library, over to the intersection of, I think it's Whitwer and Main Street.
And this is based on sampling, as far as I've found, I haven't found anything more recent, was done 15 years ago. So it could be further, it could be less. And maybe there's some reports that I don't know about. Yeah.
I thought I heard you say that you were part of a community group in where you live.
Yeah.
And how best did your group make advances to getting the situation better?
Well, we basically organized, we obtained technical assistance from EPA. We hired somebody who could advise us on some of this stuff. Basically, every time a document comes out, our consultant reviews it or I review it, and we make comments saying this is good, this needs to be done better, and we make sure that the press finds out about these things. I developed a working relationship with the people from EPA. EPA will come to a public meeting or they'll have a poster session, and I always find the most important parts of the meeting are the 15 minutes before and the 15 minutes after. So I remember a meeting it was a Navy-sponsored meeting about contamination, and the last two people standing in the parking lot, myself and the project manager for EPA. And that's where I learned that Google had contamination in their two buildings, and that Evandale Avenue, the hot spots, had been discovered. And of course I told the press about it, the local press, and actually the guy was on vacation. I had to tell him a few times. And then he did the story, and based on that, we had a response. But then we had a series of meetings, some of which I organized, some of which EPA organized, where the people in the affected area would ask questions. The most important thing is sunshine. And again, what's happening here is what has to happen. People who might be affected, either through the water they drink, the air they breathe, where they send their kids to school, need to be informed. And it's, I went to North Carolina trying to relieve people's panic. Okay, you should have mitigation in your school, but you don't have to close it. They were already too scared, and they got the school board to close the school. So I'm not suggesting you go around and you scare people unnecessarily. But people have to be informed to make a reasonable judgment about what's done with the contamination, what's done with the properties. And again, it's a matter of organizing community groups that go to city councils, that go to EPA. When you ask EPA to have a public meeting about these sites, they'll do it. EPA is required to consult with the public when they make decisions about how these things are done. It's a little bit harder when you've got a voluntary cleanup as opposed to a Superfund cleanup, but EPA is really strong on involving the public. In fact, the people in EPA who were involved in this site that I talked to were involved in writing the community involvement section of the final vapor intrusion guidance. So sometimes they just don't know where to go to find the community people that are interested. And when you get in touch with them, a lot of them are actually looking for community people. My feeling is that my community was selected by EPA, particularly by EPA Region 9 in San Francisco, to be US EPA's first large national investigation of vapor intrusion because they knew they had a lot of community support. It wasn't because we went to them and said, we want to be first. They knew we've been involved in overseeing all kinds of contamination fights in our community since 1981. So they knew if they started the investigation in Mountain View, that they would have public support. And support from our congresswoman, support from our city council. And that made it easier for them to move forward and to do some of the things sort of on a pilot basis that are now embedded in the national guidance.
And that's where I would like to, again, remind you what I said earlier. There's not enough sunshine here in North Canton. City officials do not want to talk about this. There was, again, a committee created here a number of years ago called SWAP, Source Water Area Protection, Wellhead Protection. And when they actually brought to council that they wanted to further discuss this Hoover plume, whatever you want to call it, and fracking and other issues, City Council just closed down that committee. So you need to be contacting City Hall and asking them to put pressure on this owner over here